and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Wang Yinzhi in Beijing. From October the 13th to 17th, President Xi Jinping is paying a state visit to Cambodia and Bangladesh and will attend the BRICS summit in India. After his first stop in the 5-day trip and his first state visit to Cambodia as president, what course has been set for development between the two countries, and what steps can China and Cambodia take together to improve working relations with ASEAN? And what immediate results can we expect his just concluded visit to Cambodia to achieve? To discuss these questions and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Teng Jianqun from China Institute of International Studies and Harvey Zoden, columnist for China Daily. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Chinese President Xi Jinping was all smiles as he arrived in Cambodia for his first official state visit to the country. The trip is aimed at further strengthening China's traditional friendship with its regional neighbour and deepening the two countries' strategic partnership. President Xi met with Cambodian King Norodom Sihamoni and the Queen Mother in the capital Phnom Penh. Xi also held talks with Prime Minister Hun Sen and witnessed the signing of bilateral deals designed to increase cooperation in trade, investment and tourism. Cambodia's previous king, the current king's father, worked hand-in-hand with CPC founders to build the strong friendship that the two nations enjoy today. China is Cambodia's largest trading partner and its largest source of foreign investment. In 2015, bilateral trade reached $4.4 billion, a rise of 18% from the year before. The Phnom Penh Autonomous Port is 30 kilometers from Cambodia's capital. 80% of the goods that the port handles are headed either to or from China, and China helped build the port as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Business leaders hope it will connect economic centers across Asia and beyond.
To do good business, we have to meet the interests of both sides. It's good for Cambodia to get loan from China, and we hope it's good for China to increase its business with Cambodia.
President Xi has now left Cambodia and arrived in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. The trip marks the first state visit to the country by a Chinese president in more than 30 years. After that, President Xi will fly to the western Indian state of Goa for the 8th BRICS summit, where he will meet with leaders from Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa.
All right, now let's start our discussion here in the studio with Mr. Harvey Zoden and Mr. Teng Jianqun. Welcome you both to Dialogue. So President Xi Jinping has just concluded his visit to Cambodia with over 30 deals signed and a lot of packages of aid. So what attracts your attention most, Mr. Teng Jianqun? Let me start with you.
Of course, the continuation of the cooperation between the two sides. In 1958, the two countries established the diplomatic relations, and in so many years, the two countries actually have enjoyed their good relation. We always say Cambodia is a good neighbor, is a good brother, is a good partner, is a good friend to China. And since we are facing new challenges nowadays, for example, in the dispute of South China Sea, Cambodia actually has given very strong support for the rare and square, game for the region. So this is actually a very important support for China, and also this is very good for the sake of the regional countries, especially in maintaining peace and stability in ASEAN.
But throughout the many decades of relationship between China and Cambodia, we're not only seeing the ups but also downs. So Mr. Zoden, give us an idea of how do we come so far from that time to now, and what kind of nature do we have now?
Well, countries' national interests, their core interests, stay the same, but they're expressed in different ways. And yes, there's been a tortuous history between the two countries and the leaders of Cambodia and China. But I think we're at a point now where it's a win-win situation for the bilateral relationship. Cambodia is kind of in a situation where it's the best of times the worst of times. Its economy is growing, starting from a small base, but it also has a lot of problems with its agricultural economics and in other infrastructure in other parts of its economy. So it needs to grow those very, very quickly. China can use allies in the region, especially with respect to the South China Sea issue. And while I think it has both positive and negative implications for ASEAN, because Cambodia in a way is acting as China's lapdog in ASEAN, China gets benefits from this relationship as well.
Well, we will talk about China, ASEAN, and Cambodia later in this program, but I would like to point out that you said the best of times and the worst of times. What do you mean by that?
For Cambodia, the best of times in that they're getting billions in US dollars, RMB, whatever currency you want to talk about, from China. At the same time, they're getting significant aid, not anywhere on the scale of China's aid. So they're really in a position to jumpstart their economy when it needs to be jumpstarted because the base is so small. And now the country seems to be on a more sound political footing. So that's the best of times. The worst of times is that they have many, many problems, as I alluded to before. And those problems, you can't just throw money at those problems. But I do have to say that one of China's best initiatives is the Belt and Road Initiative. And Cambodia is really on board there. And I think that this can build their infrastructure. It can help with their shipping and with their many power generation and other issues like that. So for them, it's both the best and worst of times.
Of course, Cambodia is totally on board with the One Belt and One Road initiative. But here's the problem. Cambodia was not historically on the either belt or the road. So how can China sell this concept to Cambodia?
Actually, Road and Belt Initiative is a vision. It's not only a physical road or passage over the sea. It gave the people of the countries such a bright, and promising future. If you are interested in such initiative or mechanism, you can, join the mechanism construction. Actually, it's open, it's inclusive, and everyone can have the opportunity to enjoy the privilege of the cooperation around the road and around the passage over the sea. So this is actually not a traditional or historical one. This is actually a new vision for the cooperation among nations in this region.
Mr. Zodin, how do you see China's initiative of Belt and Road that can be put into Cambodia's development of its economy?
They have so many infrastructure problems that almost anything will be helpful. For instance, the agricultural problems. They have to transship things through Vietnam, not always a friendly country with Cambodia, and also through Thailand. And it makes the expense much higher than it would ordinarily be. So one of the projects of One Belt, One Road will be a railway system. And that railway system should lower the costs and also improve the infrastructure in the country. And this goes for dams and other power generating equipment. So there's a lot of things that Cambodia needs that One Belt, One Road can do. But I want to say one thing about One Belt and One Road. It has 5 pillars, and people usually think about only infrastructure. But I think the 5th pillar is very important as well. The 5th pillar is people-to-people cooperation. And I believe that this should never get lost. And so it's important to build infrastructure, but you have to build bridges between people as well. And I think this is one of the beauties of One Belt, One Road.
While state-owned giant Chinese corporations are investing billions of dollars in infrastructure, in mines, railway, and textile operations, it is those family-owned private companies that are really dominating the Cambodian economy. Tell us more about that, Mr. Chen Jianqing.
Yeah, we paid a visit, I think, 2 years ago to Cambodia, and we saw the infrastructure to some extent a little bit poor, even in the capital of Cambodia, and a lot of road without, hardened, paved way. So this is a very important area for the two sides to cooperate in the infrastructure improvement. And I think the Cambodia side actually gave a very positive echo to the proposal to have not only the Road and Belt Initiative but also AIB. And actually, as the first member state of that bank, Cambodia has already got some, loan from the bank. This is a very beneficial, not only for the bankers but also for the country in Cambodia. So I think the cooperation in this regard will be greatly improved, especially after our president visit to Cambodia this time. This is the first state visit by our president in recent 30 years.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned about the fifth pillar, the people-to-people exchanges. Well, young Cambodians, historically Cambodians are really used to a presence of Western countries, even Vietnam, the Southeast nations. But the young Cambodians are exposed to a lot of information, many of them coming from the West. So how can China influence those young Cambodians? How young Cambodians accept China?
I think that social media and making connections between young Chinese and young Cambodians is one way to do this. And I'm a big fan of WeChat. WeChat has a great translator built in, and it allows people who can't speak a language in common to get to know each other. And I hope that one day a technology like that can be built that does build a bridge between people as young children, as young as 6 or 7 years old. So I think that's one way. I think another way is cultural exchanges, bringing the best of Chinese culture to Cambodia, bringing the best of Cambodian culture, which I personally know very little about, to China, because I think it'd be a wonderful learning experience to share the culture neighbor to neighbor.
Though both countries are very enthusiastic about this Belt and Road Initiative, what kind of obstacles are there?
There are some obstacles. For example, how can they start the cooperation from which point? This is a very important point for the countries concerned. For example, if you launch some loan to some countries, how can you get benefit? This is actually the purpose for the bank construction, I mean AIB. And of course, the different culture and different attitude toward the cooperation gave another aspect to the cooperation. And for example, some NGOs in Cambodia, I think I was told 2 years ago there are about 4,000 NGOs. Not only from Asian, but also from the United States, from European countries. They always published some paper saying that the project initiated by China will give very hurt to the environment, and they published papers. They published articles and gave such a propaganda. And the authorities of Cambodia did care about these, propaganda, these papers and these articles, and sometimes they suspend the project. And this is actually a difference between the two countries in the approaches to the cooperation. So we have a lot of homework to do to have a common consensus in dealing with these obstacles.
Of course, a different perspective that maybe play into the picture. What about you, Mr. Zodin? What do you think, what kind of obstacles are the two countries facing?
Well, I think generally on the One Belt, One Road program, an obstacle is the large amount of money that China is lending to the recipient countries through the various financial institutions. The question is, are they ever going to pay, are those projects ever going to pay for themselves? And if not, China will be in a position where they'll have to forgive the loans or put pressure on the country. And one of the features of President Xi's current visit, or just past visit to Cambodia, was some loan forgiveness. So this may come up again in the future.
So the loan forgiveness, many may question what's China's motive, and some Western countries are saying if China is giving aid to Cambodia without any strings attached, without any conditions, what is China hoping to gain?
Actually, this is not a Bank of China. Actually, there are about 60 member states and in the AIB, and I'm sure all the member states will give some, comprehensive, assessment on any investment, including the investment in Cambodia. And after that, the bankers can give the loan. This is actually a procedure for any bank. I don't think this is a bank for China, that China's money will only be used in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, and other countries. This is actually a common interest, a common benefit, and they will have a very good assessment and then get a good result.
All right, now let's take a short break here, but when we come back, we'll discuss more about Cambodia's position in between China and U.S. as well as ASEAN. Stay with us. Welcome back to Dialogue. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Mr. Harvey Zodin and Mr. Teng Jianqun talking about President Xi Jinping's just wrapped up visit to Cambodia. So earlier we talked about trade and cooperation and the Belt and Road Initiative between China and Cambodia. Now let's talk about Cambodia's role in its regional peace and stability. What kind of role can Cambodia play in Southeast Asia?
First, I should say the balance of power in this region actually has been changed, or is being changed in recent years. For example, China is more willing to use its influence, not only trade and economy, but also security cooperation has been intensified between the two sides, I mean between China and ASEAN countries, and senior generals, PRA, paid frequent visit to the ASEAN countries, and we also carried out joint military drills bilaterally and multilaterally. This just shows the change or adjustment of our policy. The ASEAN country used to maintain a balanced relation, with China and with the United States. Sometimes, on security, they would like to prefer to have a good relation with the United States. On trade, they prefer to go to China. So actually, China and the United States both have changed or adjusted their policy toward this region. And China, enhanced its cooperation in security, and the United States also enhanced its cooperation in economy. For example, TPP actually, included Vietnam and the Philippines. So this is actually a competition of a new model.
A competition of new model, a rivalry of influence in that region. Those are very, very interesting topics here. But I would like to ask you, Harvey, is that the Belt and Road Initiative is, of course, a very strong link interconnectivity campaign in that region. But will it rival the presence of ASEAN?
I think they're not either or. They're not mutually exclusive. I think that the Belt and Road program, because it's so rich, will, I think, provide a lot of infrastructure improvement in the many countries that participated, not only in this region, but throughout the world in the near future. Now, for ASEAN, they have aspirations of setting up something like the European Economic Community that was a predecessor to the EU. And I think that that's important as well. I think that they can exist side by side, but one thing that has been a problem, I believe, is that by Cambodia taking such a strong pro-China stance, especially on South China Sea, this method of operation of ASEAN called the ASEAN Way, where things are reached by consensus, behind the scenes, face saving, and so on, that this has been a bit damaged in the last years because of China's strong position on South China Sea.
If you recall, the year 2012, when Cambodia was the chairmanship of ASEAN, because of Cambodia's stance, support of China's South China Sea claim, there's no a joint communique issued that year. That's unprecedented in many decades of ASEAN's establishment. So how would you say that this would affect the China-ASEAN as well as Cambodia-ASEAN relationship?
Yeah, the chairmanship of Cambodia in 2012, you mentioned just now, actually gave a very important impact on the situation in the summit among the ASEAN countries and the 10+3, 10+8. And if we look at nowadays result, especially after the ruling of arbitration initiated by the Philippines, actually such a position given by the Cambodian government is a real and a very proper position to maintain the peace and stability in this region. And today the Philippines also returned to the table of negotiation, and they said the arbitration already turned another page. So this is actually a good position, not only for China. I don't think Cambodia is ally, as our gentleman mentioned. It's a friend, is a partner, is a good neighbor, and the mutual support for each other actually gave very important significance to the regional peace and stability.
And Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen was quick to react after the arbitration at The Hague of a ruling that about the South China Sea issue. That's also a very strong support for China from Cambodia. But will that affect the relationship between Cambodia and ASEAN, which contains some countries that are also claimants in the South China Sea?
A number of those countries are not happy about Cambodia's decision. And I think, especially if you look at the fact that after Cambodia got ASEAN to weaken its statement significantly after the arbitration ruling, that just by magic, a couple days later, $600 million in aid came from China to Cambodia. It looks like Cambodia could be for sale, and I think a lot of the other countries in ASEAN and outside of it don't like that very much.
And another factor that we have to talk about is U.S. influence in the region. Well, both U.S. and China are really hoping to improve its influence in the Asia Pacific. And like we mentioned earlier, China has no strings attached to the aid in Cambodia. On the other hand, U.S. sometimes have a lot of conditions for its aid to improve democracy as well as rule of law and anti-corruption campaigns there. So what kind of relationship does Cambodia have with the U.S. versus with China?
I think there is a big change that the United States has been trying its best to improve relations with ASEAN countries. Recently, the Obama administration lifted the sanction against Myanmar and also lifted some sanctions against Cambodia in recent years. So this is actually an effort by the United States. They try the best to improve the relations and to get more influence in this region, because the rebalance strategy by the Obama administration actually manipulated the contradiction in the South China Sea. And this is actually offshoring theory by the powers 100 years ago in European continent, and they try to manipulate the contradiction between the countries, between China and these neighboring countries, and for the dominance in this region. This is actually a very clear signal given by the U.S. government. At the very beginning, when the Obama administration announced the strategy, the officials, the senior officials always said, no, we're not going to target it at the China. But nowadays, if you listen carefully, especially from the Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, he gave a very clear-cut, announcement. This strategy just to target at China. So I think the influence, of course, of the United States in this region has been a long status there, and the uprising of China, the rising of China in recent 30 years, did change the balance of power in this region. The United States actually has been worrying about the development, about their dominance, in this region.
That's why we call this a Thucydides trap, where rising power can always pose a challenge to the existing superpower. But can Cambodia balance this delicate act with the U.S. and with China? Can it manipulate the two? Of course, as a small country, it's very difficult.
But I think they're in the best position to do that, because they can take from both sides. They're kind of like a all-American college player who wants to play football in the NFL. And so they have their pick of who they go to, and everybody wants them. So I think that they can, I'm not sure, play off one side against the other, but I think they can take advantage of the fact that both sides want to cooperate. And about the American policy, I think the American policy, unlike China's policy, as you mentioned, not usually, but always has strings attached, and those strings attached regard human rights and governance and rule of law and all these kinds of things. I think this is kind of Boy Scout diplomacy or Girl Scout diplomacy, because I think you have to engage in real politics. And while I believe that Hillary Clinton's probably going to be elected, she's tough, but she's a realist, and I think we'll have more real politics and maybe a little bit less Boy Scout politics in the future.
But if a Democrat was elected, that may means a lot of more influence in other regions, as versus to Mr. Donald Trump's protectionist sentiment there. So what kind of future influence will U.S. have in that region and in Cambodia?
Generally speaking, I think the competition between China and the United States in Cambodia will be intensified because, to our knowledge, a lot of senior officials in recent years have paid visit to Cambodia, including the First Lady. I think 2 years ago paid a visit to Cambodia, and this is a strong signal that the United States is willing today to improve its relations and in every aspect. So I'd like to say the Cambodia administration will have a balanced relation with China and with the United States and with other major powers in the world. This is the best choice for them.
And what about China? What's China's next move?
I think China has to continue to do what they're doing with Cambodia. I think they're doing a pretty good job. If you look at the imbalance between American aid with all its conditions and a much less amount of money, and the significant amount that's coming both in the forms of foreign aid plus One Belt, One Road from China, I think China's pretty much where it should be with respect to Cambodia.
Thank you very much for your analysis. That was Mr. R.V. Zoden and Mr. Teng Juanqin here in the studio. And that'll do it for today's dialogue. If you want to see more, just type dialogue into your search engine and search for CCTV News Dialogue Program. I'm Wang Yingzhi here in Beijing. From all the team here from Dialogue, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.